I just started recording, so feel free.
Okay, so I'm going to share screen. Oops. Slideshow. Here's interview. Okay. Can you guys, is what you see just like sharing your story? No. Have I not shared yet?
We see you sharing your screen, but we see your main slide and then all the other slides below too. So it's not full screen, just so you know.
Oh. Okay, give me a sec here. Oh, advanced portion of
the percentage view, I think. That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
I think. No, still the notes. Oh, okay, now? That's it. No.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, hi everyone. I'm Kate. I think most of you know me. So this, I think, is one of the most critical modules because so much of I-CBT is about narrative. And so I've got a lot to go through, so I'll get started. So I wanted to start with a quote by Joan Didion. "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience." So how do humans come to conclusions? Do we just follow data with a blank mind and see where it leads us? No. Humans don't see things in isolation. Everything in our lives exists in a context that is within relationship to something else. Humans are meaning makers. We connect dots. We assign cause and effect. We are constantly assessing the world around us to try to make sense of things, to figure out what happened before, what's happening now, what will happen next, and what it all means. And we carry our stories with us. Everything we see through the lens of existing stories. Pre-existing knowledge and stories cannot help but influence what we see and what information we gather and then treat as evidence. So the cloud bubble is the story. So let's say that I have a story in my head that my mom cooks dinner around 6 p.m. So when I start to smell food or hear a bunch of banging around in the kitchen and it's around 6 p.m., I will take these pieces of data and see them as supporting evidence for the story that my mom's cooking dinner. Let's say that I even go into the kitchen and there's something cooking on the stove and dishes are in the sink and there's a knife with some chopped vegetables on the counter, but she's not there. My pre-existing story will still likely lead me to conclude that she's just stepped out or had to use the bathroom or something like that. My narrative will remain. But let's say my story were something bad is going to happen to my family. If I heard a bunch of banging around in the kitchen, I might run down to make sure my mom is okay. And when I see that she's not there, I might conclude that she's been kidnapped. I might not even notice the fact that it's 6 p.m. or that the smell of food is in the air, or that there are vegetables on the counter being chopped, or that there's something on the stove. Or if I do notice these things, they don't alter my story in any way, and I just find some other way to explain them so they fit the current narrative I have. So ongoing narratives lead us to interpret certain thoughts in a particular way, and we draw conclusions based on those interpretations. So that's the way I-CBT kind of conceptualizes things differently than the idea of intrusive thoughts. So I'll just say that again. Ongoing narratives lead us to interpret certain thoughts in a particular way, and we draw conclusions based on those interpretations. So the critical thing for clients to be able to ask themselves is, did I arrive at this conclusion because of the evidence or because of a pre-existing narrative? In other words, do I have a story in my head already and I'm just finding or interpreting information in a certain way to confirm this narrative is true? Or did this information actually lead me to this conclusion? So did the conclusion already exist before finding the evidence? Another way to think about this is being under a spell. A spell, like a narrative, it follows you around everywhere until you break it. So you can ask, are you under a spell that is causing you to see everything in a certain way? And I like this, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, because she was, the narrative in her head is, I'm going to go see my grandmother. And she is sort of so stuck in that narrative that even when, sure, there are some signs that she's seeing her grandmother, you see the clothes and the voice is sort of speaking as grandma-esque, but the grandma's a wolf, right? And this wolf has eaten her grandmother. So that's just one kind of little example of how our narratives can really influence everything that we interpret. So I'm going to give you an example from my own life. So up until 2022, when we moved to this house here in Boston, Maine, full time, we lived in Boston in this really cool historic home that was built in 1880. The house was originally this whole thing. It was divided in two, so we had just half of this. But so it had some really cool pieces of history, like the original floors, which had nails in it that were hand carved, because it was pre-industrialization. And there was the original brass doorknobs, and they were really ornate and beautiful. Okay, so we would usually drive up to Maine on Friday night. We'd spend the weekend there and then drive back down to Boston on Sunday night. But there were some weekends where my husband would stay in Maine with the dogs, and I would drive back to Boston on Sunday night by myself, and I'd stay in the house alone all week. So during those nights alone in the house, I started getting really scared. I would hear creaks and my mind would just go wild. I would become convinced that someone was in the house and that I was going to get tied up and tortured and eventually killed. Now, we had a very sensitive alarm system, and so there's no way anyone could break in or even move around the house because they would trip a sensor. But there were still times that I would get so scared that I would shout out from my bed, I can hear you, I know you're down there. And even, despite knowing the situation with the alarm, but I would be so convinced that someone was in the house. And so convinced that, in fact, once I called the police and they came to the house with, their guns drawn and searched the perimeter and inside the house. And of course, they didn't find anything. So the question is, why did hearing a creak so quickly get linked with, I'm in horrible danger? So in order to answer that, I'd like to talk about this concept of bridging. This is brought up in the manual, but it's not in the worksheets. And I think it's incredibly helpful, and it can also be fun. So bridging is when you take two unrelated concepts and find a way to connect them. So in my example, I am home alone gets bridged with, I get brutally murdered at the hands of a psychopath. So the more these things get linked in my mind, the richer the narrative became. So what created this bridge in the first place? Well, it was this stuff, right? I used to consume this stuff a lot. The drive up from Boston to Maine is about 3 hours, and all the way up, we'd listen to all this true crime stuff. And if I could convince my husband, we'd listen to more on the way back down. And I learned about so many serial killers and so many brutal crimes, many of which are committed against women. And I started consuming this stuff initially for fun, and I thought it was kind of interesting from the psychological aspect. But then I think part of me thought that the more I consumed it, the more knowledge I would have, and that would kind of allow me to prepare myself for this like inevitable experience. It was going to be terrible. And that would allow me to keep myself safe. So, but when you start to, but when you start to consume so many stories about like psychopaths killing vulnerable women at home alone, these two things get linked in your mind. And so each time I watch one of these shows, that story became richer and more detailed and just more potent. But so what if I had created a bridge with something else? So what if I'd linked it with having a nice quiet evening, watching some historical drama like The Crown, which, you know, I can only watch when I'm home alone because my husband says he's reached his limit of shows about fancy English people. So I might hear the sounds in the house and think, oh yeah, that's probably because this house comes from a totally different era. And the historical shows I was watching might remind me that I'm living in a home that was built nearly a century and a half ago. My narrative would include things like that it was built back when people dressed like this. And back in 1880, the year the house was built, electricity wasn't even invented in Boston yet. The first automobile wouldn't be invented until about 15 years later. So of course there are going to be creaks in this old house. We actually had this old map of the neighborhood, which was created right around the time the house was built. And we could see on the map that the guy who owned the house, his last name was Chipman. He was a banker and a farmer at the same time, which was like apparently a common thing. But excuse me, I might hear these creaks in the house and think about him and his family and how cool it is that I get to spend time in this little slice of history. So the bridge in this case would look like this. So I'm home alone, gets bridged with, I get to watch hours of historical dramas about fancy English people. So this is a quote from Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, which is the book that preceded the manual that most of us have been reading. So the amazing point about bridging is how we are able, by drawing on experience, to connect the most remote and unlikely statements and accord such invented relatedness, not only a sense, but an inevitability. So the key point is that you can connect any two things, and with enough detail, you can create a very, very convincing story. The more you imagine it, the richer it becomes. So you can really have fun with this with your clients. So in this exercise, I just pick some random song lyrics, and I have clients pick a cloud and pick a star, and then come up with some story that links the two. You feel free to use this or come up with your own. The goal is to help clients see that with enough detail to bridge the two statements, they eventually seem very connected, even though they're actually totally unrelated. So I picked in this first one, he sold his car for a one-way ticket back to We Don't Talk About Bruno. So the bridge would be, he sold his car for a one-way ticket back. Bruno broke his heart. He's going back to his old life and doesn't want to hear Bruno's name ever again. We don't talk about Bruno. And then here I connected, he sold his car for a one-way ticket back to There Wasn't a Cloud in the Sky. So he sold his car for a one-way ticket back. He was moving back to New York City where he didn't need a car. That first day back without his car, he was reminded how pleasant walking is. It was a gorgeous day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. So these two concepts, like they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. One is from a song about the midnight train to Georgia. And the second one is from Encanto. Like they're so unrelated, but you can create anything that will link the two if you have enough detail. So back to my situation. So how did I solve my issue of freaking out while home alone? Did I tell my husband I couldn't spend the night home alone anymore and that he had to stay with me? No. What eventually made my fear go away was I stopped consuming so much material about crime. That solved it. In other words, I stopped feeding my imagination and perpetuating the narrative. So I wanted to say something about imaginal exposure versus this alternative narrative. So creating a new narrative in some ways can be kind of the opposite of imaginal exposure. The point of imaginal exposure is to go into your imagination, into your current story, and feel all the feelings and think all the thoughts that you've been avoiding. So some therapists will say the goal is to realize you can handle this discomfort. Others might say the goal is to become numb to the thoughts because you've heard them so many times and now you know they're just thoughts. But whatever the intent behind the imaginal exposure, the bottom line is that the client is to go into their imagination and play out their OCD story. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying imaginal exposure is wrong or doesn't work. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that in I-CBT, the approach is different. It's not better or worse, it's just different. In I-CBT, the thinking is that the more we engage with the narrative, the richer and more detailed it becomes. So we want people with OCD to not go into this story. We want to bring them back into the here and now so that they can learn to rely on their senses. So the goal will be to create a story which is more aligned with their senses. So how do we create a new story? We bridge things, right? We create a brand new story. And so here's an example from Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. I can give you the page number, but basically it's from the story of a woman who, this is her OCD story, of a woman who was convinced for several years that her house was contaminated by urine. So I use the toilet at work, and as I'm wiping myself, I feel that my fingers are wet. I conclude that I have urine on my fingers, on the side of my index finger. I wipe my finger with more toilet paper. Since there are no wash bowls, I cannot wash my hands, and the urine stays on my finger all day. For me, if something is there, it stays there until you wash it. I arrange it so I don't touch things at work with my index finger to avoid contaminating things. If I touch something with that finger, a part of what is on my finger will find itself on that particular object. When I get home, I open the patio door with both my hands while trying to avoid touching the door with that part of my finger that touched urine. If that part touches the door, a part of the urine on my finger will find itself on the door. What is on the door stays on the door because I have not washed my finger. The next day, I suddenly realize that other people have touched the door. So now they have urine on their fingers. Because these people touch objects in my home, there is urine here and there is urine in my home. There's urine here and there in my home. Okay, so some things to keep in mind when creating an alternative story. The purpose of creating an alternative story is not to disprove the OCD story. The purpose is to create doubt about the legitimacy of the OCD story, to remove it from its pedestal as the story. So the basic requirement for the alternative story is that it not conflict with the senses, that it be consistent with the senses. It should begin at the primary source of the OCD inference. And the more detail, the better. Keep in mind, we are competing with the OCD story, which often has had years to develop richness and detail. In working with clients to create alternative stories, we help them see that their current story is just a story, just like the alternative story is just a story, that it's all stories. But some stories are based more on the imagination and others are based in reality. And they get to choose which one to be the narrative that they carry. So you can see here that I spent so much time on this graphic, that these are the same, the dots are the same, but things are just connected differently. So here is the woman's alternative narrative, which also comes from Beyond Reasonable Doubt. So when I wipe myself with toilet paper, I remove the bit of urine I had on my fingers. If I wipe on the counter, I trust my senses in order to know if there is still water or not by looking or by touching. I have no reason to behave otherwise with urine. If I have a cola on my fingers, it is the sticky sensation that will indicate if there is more. If I don't feel anything or see anything, then I will believe that there is nothing on my hands. The fact that I consider urine dirty is not proof that I have some on my fingers, but simply a way of removing myself from my senses. When I feel dirty, it is simply because of things I imagine. So the fact that I feel dirty is not proof that I am dirty. Even if I had urine on my fingers, it must have evaporated during the day, since it was not long after that I didn't feel it on my fingers anymore. If I wash my hands and do not wipe them afterwards, water will end up evaporating by itself and I will feel nothing on my hands. There's no reason for this to be different for urine. It is also possible that the urine dries up. When something is dry, it becomes impossible to transmit it from one thing to another. So next, we want to compare both stories with the client by asking, do you agree with the idea that both stories are equally plausible? So just a reminder that plausible means you could make a reasonably valid case for something, while possible means something is capable of becoming true, though it's not always reasonable. So usually the client will agree that both stories are equally possible. Sometimes clients will say that they find the obsessional story more convincing, which should come as no surprise. But the question is about the stories being equally plausible. So the client should agree that there's no basis in reason to assume that the obsessional story is any more valid than the alternative story. So in terms of providing instructions or guidance, you want to advise clients initially to only practice the alternative story outside of OCD situations. Once clients are progressing, they should only invoke the alternative story in OCD situations when they're pretty confident that the alternative story can override the OCD story rather than the other way around. If clients start using the alternative story when they are triggered, it risks becoming a compulsion. What we want is the alternative story to be practiced regularly enough that it is more naturally accessible than the OCD story in their minds. Also keep in mind that practicing the story is not a thought exercise. We want the client to experience this in the imagination, really see the scene and experience it in the way you do whenever you're imagining something vivid, the way that they do with their OCD story. So alternative stories do not come into play when a client is in the bubble. So I think Jeremy asked about this in the Facebook group. So when you're in the bubble, that is when you want clients to do the bridge exercise that's described in module 8, where clients pause, identify the jumping off point between reality and the imagination, and actively choose to return to or stay on the side of reality. So alternative stories, again, if you use it when you're in the bubble, it can become a compulsion. So we want it to, it's sort of preemptive. You're doing it before. So the criteria for proceeding to the next stage depends on each individual client. Some will prefer to leave the OCD story behind for a while and just focus on developing and exploring the alternative narrative. Others might prefer to continue to rehearse the alternative narrative while at the same time working to deconstruct the obsessional narrative. How to proceed can be discussed with this client, but in general, it's often best to allow the client to work on the alternative narrative for a couple of sessions until they feel the alternative story is starting to get into shape. So lastly, I just wanted to conclude with this quote. As we become aware of ourselves as storytellers, we realize we can use our stories to heal and make ourselves whole. Alrighty, so I will stop sharing. yeah.
Thank you so much, Kate. There's a question that just came in the chat, which might be a good starting point as for other discussion as well. Someone asking, what is the bubble?
Oh, what is the bubble? So I think the bubble is described in module 7, but it's basically like when you're in your when you're in your imagination, when kind of the OCD has taken over and you've like crossed the bridge, so to speak. It's when your OCD narrative is really alive and potent, and you're kind of stuck in that place. Should I read the comments? Should I try to like find questions from there?
Maybe, although there's a part that might detract about cats having sex.
So,
But it was such a good presentation. There's so much to digest. I hope you are also willing to share. Well, I know I'm recording it, but like sharing the slides too. Like I could imagine just like spending quite a few minutes on each slide, just like really taking some of this in.
yeah, sure, of course. So any other questions?
I do have a question, or I have a
Yeah.
thought. I went back and rewatched Natalia's video about a week or so ago, and so I got a lot of the stuff from that pinging around in my head. And one thing that I love about it is when they're doing the non-OCD story, they're doing, she has this comment about don't use OCD's language in this. Ground yourself in the language of the here and now. And you're talking about this as well. We're not using this when you're in the bubble to try to argue your way out. It's just to cast some doubt when you have the invitation to go into the bubble. But this is one of the hardest areas where clients have these really fixed ideas about things, where I feel the most push-pull to go towards like disputational stuff. As we're trying to create a reality-based narrative, like not every client is able to say, this doubt is ridiculous. Maybe more like they're saying, I have evidence from the here and now that cast out on that, but like they don't get to a place of certainty. And I use like sexual orientation as one of the examples of that. I'm just curious if anyone else has found that this is a place where we have to be super careful about not going that disputational route, and how we get to a reality-based story and provide this education about the way our mind works and the way the world works without getting into the push-pull.
So this is a good question. So if you think about, another way to think about this is if with people who have, who are kind of preoccupied by something happening in the future, right? So you can't really necessarily rely on the senses in the same way for something that's going to happen in the future, the way that you would like if it's in the present. And so you're making it up still, right? Like you're still turning to your imagination because it hasn't happened yet if it's in the future, but you just pick things that are more grounded in reality, even if you don't, and you kind of can't entirely agree with it because it's in the future, but there is an element of making it up, but you're just relying on, I think Teresa had one where she talked about a client who was like afraid something was gonna, I don't know, something bad was gonna happen, and instead of, you start at the same point, but then he ended up like having a good day, right? So you just create, all that matters is you start at the same point and it's just a different outcome. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I have maybe a similar question then. Like the building the alternative story that's based on like the real self, then that is an entirely different exercise than practice building alternative stories that came earlier. Is that correct? Like one part of this is like trying to just practice the skill of being able to imagine alternative possibilities.
Yes.
And then this is really more delving into leaning on reality and what's more likely to be the true self as you're building an alternative story to kind of, I want to say counter the OCD, even though I know it's not meant to counter the OCD.
It's not meant to counter the OCD, it's meant to compete.
Compete. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know, does Fred,
So you're saying that really we're doing more of that in session 11, that the point of this is about learning how to build those stories, and we're having examples of like creating that bridge and saying, okay, I can catch my mind doing this trick. But we're
right, this is not when you're saying I'm not a pedophile, this is the type of person that I am, this, you know, this is when
it's about, I mean, the essence of the alternative story is taking a different perspective. I think that's a good way to describe it, where you say, like, take a different perspective, take a different attitude towards everything that you're looking at. And was a great presentation, by the way, Catherine, and the whole bridging, and there's a creative element to that, you know. There's a creative element. It's not about reasoning your way out of the OCD. But I mean, yes, it can be used that way, because people with OCD are very used to sort of like try to reason the way out of the OCD on the basis of some sort of problem that needs resolving. You know? The alternative story sort of explores the possibility that maybe there is nothing to resolve, because there is no problem, because the primary inference is wrong. Now, the way I approach it in therapy is that, and I think, Jeremy, you alluded to that requires some education, but people with OCD are quite aware when they are compulsing, when they're using, you have to remind them, but when they're using a story and trying to get out of it, and when they're ruminating in a compulsive way, they know how to differentiate that from actually just taking a different perspective in an alternative story. That's at least equally plausible, but also a story that's more based in the senses and in some ways more plausible. Now, in terms of challenging the OCD story, you don't do that with the obsessional story. It stands on its own as taking on a different perspective, a different attitude. When there is some sort of form of challenging is when you address the reasoning orders within the obsessional story itself. You know, you can call that challenging if you want to call it. It's more like identify the process and showing the process and showing how this leads to obsessional inferences. Does it answer a little bit on the question that was raised as far as how to use the obsessional narrative, the non-obsessional narrative, the real story in a way?
Yes.
Hey, Fred, I had a quick question, which is, when we're talking about rehearsing the real story, so to speak, outside of the OCD bubble, one way I've tried to explain it is that it sort of creates an availability heuristic from a cognitive standpoint. Like if we're talking about, like, the obsessional story is very much available all the time, because we're rehearsing it all the time, right? We spend years rehearsing the story. We don't spend years rehearsing a real story, right? A reality-based story. So when we're rehearsing the reality-based story, we're actually creating a competitive availability heuristic in that sense. Does that track with science?
Well, I mean, that's a learning model, right? That OCD develops slowly and surely, and you do it often enough, and it gets stronger, it gets reinforced. And the same would apply for the alternative story, you could say. But we're also dealing with reasoning. I'm sorry, I heard something. Oh, we're also dealing with reasoning, right? So it can be more sudden than that, in a way. You know, when a person takes a different perspective, sort of feels like, okay, this whole OCD story is not really valid anymore. So it doesn't have to be a prolonged, torturous road of practicing and rereading. I would actually discourage that. I would actually try to keep it real and keep it alive. And that's the nice thing about what Catherine sort of showed. It's like IBA has this richness, but there's also a lot of richness, clinical richness, that you can bring in as a therapist yourself with creating these sort of exercises, these bridging exercises. Was quite well done. It's not even in our book or not even in the treatment manual, but from the theory, there's so many things you can draw on from the theory, as well as in narrative therapy in general, that you can include in that to keep it rich for the person, so that it doesn't become an automatic thing of, now I'm going to read my story. You have to keep it alive, right? You have to keep it real, and that's why everybody creating this material is so great, because it keeps it alive, and it shows different ways, like what Catherine showed with bridging and what Bronwyn has created with these exercises. You know, that's all very good, and I think that can make the therapy even richer than it already is. Just one other point that occurred to me during the presentation, which I think is like, if the narrative is sort of like, it brings in a lot of information together in a dynamic type of way, right? But you can compare it to a little bit like schemas, right? Except in that case, when you have the old Beckian model, you have like single thoughts, single beliefs. A narrative is a little bit more dynamic. It's a story which connects a whole lot of information together. And it's also, I would argue, it's the more realistic way of looking at thoughts and in a dialogue, because when we tell ourselves stories all the time. I mean, it's automatic. We don't have beliefs and separate thoughts, and that thought is the responsible for my problem, and that thought's responsible for these problematic inferences. Maybe continuously talk to ourselves in the form of stories, so it builds up. There's a dynamic to it, which is again something Catherine illustrated quite well in the pictures and graphs, how it can connect all this information into a whole. That's the power of the imagination. It's the power of narrative, in both negative and positive ways. So those were my comments.
Thank you for clarifying.
So Jackie asked, can this idea of the alternate story be used if you also practice ERP? So I think it probably depends on the kind of ERP that you're doing. When I try to combine ERP and I-CBT, it's exposing somebody to their whatever it is they fear while they practice staying connected to the senses. It's not to get further lost in the imagination. So I think you don't want to like send somebody on this tug of war between like, this thing is real and I can handle it, versus this is made up, right? Those are kind of two opposing ideas. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
If you're going to combine ERP with it, you're going to have a very pragmatic rationale.
Yeah.
Very pragmatic, like, okay, we're going to, you're still feeling anxious, you don't really believe the alternative story entirely, it doesn't have that much power for you, and let's try to see what happens if you go into an exposure type of situation. But I mean, I find it difficult. I would personally find it difficult to reconcile the idea of exposure practically. Not that, I mean, you can do ERP, but I would find it difficult to reconcile exposure with an alternative narrative that tells you there's nothing to be anxious about and you don't need to be anxious. But what you can combine it with is response prevention, because the alternative story in a way tells you there's no additional action that you need to take, you know. But if you would do ERP, I would probably make it more part of or as an extension of reality sensing exercises potentially. But even there, you sort of have the same conflict a little bit between at what point, why do you need exposure? Or the whole intent of IBA is not to induce anxiety. It's just to do things without anxiety. And exposure, as far as I know, is always with the intent to induce anxiety in one way or another. So that's hard to get around, at least from my perspective. But with response prevention, yes, you can.
And that's something that's nice about I-CBT is for our patients who are really terrified of ERP or who haven't responded well to it, I-CBT is this whole totally separate thing that you can use. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, you can do it as a standalone. You can do it as a standalone. That's how it's been validated. Or you can say, for people who've been through ERP, like you say, and maybe have not benefited, I-CBT would be a good indication, I think. if a client responds well to ERP and is able to do it, then I would say do ERP. It's fairly straightforward, right? But it doesn't always work, and in that case, people need alternatives. But in either way, I think it's a choice of the client in collaboration with the therapist.
Kate, can you finish your thought on that? I feel like you were going somewhere with that before he jumped in.
Oh, I don't remember. No, I think I said everything, but thank you. Yeah, just basically, you don't have to use ERP for it to be effective. And also, I think the messages can be really different. Again, I only use it as a way to kind of, like Fred said, practice going into a situation where you once were triggered and practice staying grounded in the here and now. Like that's how, if I were to ever use exposure, that's how I would do it. It's not to induce anxiety. It's not to convince you can handle something. That's not the goal, right? So Michelle asked, when should someone practice the alternative story? In the moment when they start to cross the bridge? Is it supposed to be a competing response, or do they practice it as homework in the day? So I have them do it as homework, right? So anytime there's an element of getting triggered, that's not when basically you want to have a story that's accessible the way the OCD story is so accessible to people all the time, where they just get triggered like that. You want to have another story that is equally available, and ideally more available, but equally available, so that you then can internalize this idea that, oh, it's all stories. I get to pick, like the OCD story is made up. There was a study described, and Fred, tell me if I'm like botching the explanation of this, but where people with OCD, this was described in Beyond Reasonable Doubt, where people with OCD, when they were presented with a conclusion and then presented, like X, Y, and Z happened. And then if they were presented with alternative conclusions, they doubted the original more. So being presented.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Did I explain that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So being presented with
I believe you're correct.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, sorry, my mic, sometimes it's choppy. Don't mean to cut you off, but yes, it's correct as far as I know. I mean, this is research from a while ago. I'm not even aware of all our research over time, but I'm pretty sure that that's what happens with people with OCD. They tend to doubt more. They easily are able to infuse doubt into certain situations, So what you're telling me sounds correct, and that's probably in the book as part of the studies that have been done on reasoning. Yeah.
Right. So that's just something to keep in mind, that the more you present someone with OCD with alternative possibilities, the more they're going to doubt that original conclusion.
That was actually something
part of the problem, but we can use it.
That was something. Oh, sorry, Kate. There's a little bit of delay. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That was something I noticed when I applied I-CBT to BDD. And I know we're not really talking about this, but they actually started doubting their obsessional doubt. And then it was like, then there was room for this other story, because the obsessional doubt narrative started to become not the only possibility. So there was more room for other stories, and then they started to doubt the obsessional doubt. So that was really cool to watch, and it kind of ties in here how the more we have to pull from, the more possibilities we have, the more that we can doubt other things. Not that we really want to, but it just makes room for these other possibilities. And because when we have OCD, if something's possible, we can start using it more and more.
Yeah.
I wanted, if it's okay, I wanted to go back to Fred. You mentioned the learning theory after Mike asked you his question. So I wonder if it might be helpful for the group if you can expand on that a little bit about how this is different than the learning theory or learning model.
Well, I mean, it's like it's a question of, and that's still up in the air. And I think learning models are sort of like extremely important to understand behavior in general, and it's an essential part of CBT. But there is some sort of discontinuity, I think, sometimes in how OCD can develop, where it doesn't necessarily over time. In many of the cases I've seen, it can be quite sudden in how OCD develops. It's not like a person slowly but surely start engaging in compulsions. An obsession can hit a person like a bomb out of nowhere, and before they didn't have OCD, when their conditions are right. So in that sense, if OCD can arise that quickly, I think theoretically it's also possible for it to dissolve that quickly. And to some extent, I-CBT goes after that, right? Where it goes for that moment of resolution in the obsessional doubt, not by resolving it, but not by resolving it intellectually, philosophically, or whatever, but by realizing how the obsession in itself is not relevant or real. And once the person really sees that, then it can be quick and sudden. So I would not automatically assume, yes, there's practice involved, but it's not and it is important, learning is part of it, and that can be slow. But I would not give up the hope either that with some clients you can do it, you can actually reach that point of resolution where the OCD actually falls apart entirely. And I've seen it happen. And I think some of the clinicians have reported that too in the group, where maybe not entirely that the OCD is gone, but there's suddenly you get these sudden drops in symptoms. And I would hook into that during treatment. So that goes beyond just that can also fit into a learning model, but it's a little bit more discontinuous than people may assume in terms of how to overcome OCD and how it is acquired. It can be quite sudden. So it can be both good and bad news. Yeah.
So is reasoning learning?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? You broke up for a second.
Is reasoning learning?
Sorry, you're still breaking up. Can you type it? Is learning? Is reasoning?
Is reasoning learning?
Whether reasoning is learning?
Is it? Yeah, is it?
Is reasoning learning? I mean, well, no. Well, it's a cognitive. It's a cognitive. It's a cognitive process. It's a cognitive activity. Something you do. Reasoning can be a lot of different things, not just learning alone, I would say. It can be a lot of different things. There's not always learning involved in reasoning. Right? It's a philosophical question almost, but
it is. I know. I'm kind of, because sometimes we get these, these questions, and I think it's important for us to kind of explore together, like, some of these differences, and that's why I'm asking, because they've come up sometimes in our group chats and on Facebook, and so making these distinctions as we're all here together, I think can kind of help us understand these differences.
Mm-hmm. Well, reasoning can be used in many ways, right? It can be used to unlearn things. It can be used to learn things. It can be used to for stupid things. It can be used for all kinds of things, right? So it's not always learning, but broadly, yeah. Hopefully, reasoning leads to learning. That would be nice, if you do it right.
I saw that there was a question way back in the chat. So it was Susan saying, please repeat the conditions when to use the alternative story as treatment is progressing. You gave a caveat. What was it?
Sure. So you initially want to just use it when you're not triggered in any way, right? You kind of want to like plant it in your mind and let it grow. You don't want to, it's not at that point where you're creating the competition at this point. But you don't use it when you're triggered initially. You can start to use it in situations where you previously had been triggered, if you're confident that the alternative story will override the OCD story. Otherwise, you're kind of doing this like convincing yourself out of something in the moment, which we don't want. Because again, you're not trying to dispute the story, the OCD story. You're creating an alternative. So yeah, so the condition is once the client is relatively confident that they won't divert to the OCD story when they're triggered. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
And again, I think it's very important to educate the patients or make them aware, like when are they obsessing or compulsing, right? And when are they not? So they have to know when they're using the difference between using an alternative story in a non-obsessional and obsessional way. And they usually know. Well, especially when you explain the OCD bubble to them, or when you point it out, they know. And then they also know how to use the story as taking a real different perspective, not in order to counter the OCD story with it, because then it becomes all one big OCD story if they try to do that. So it has to be about taking a different perspective, and in the same way that we sometimes ask people in traditional Beckian therapy to take a different perspective.
If I, as a clinician, or have been with my client when then they have started to try to do this within the bubble or do it when they're triggered, creating counter stories, how do you get back to not, is the idea then to move back to looking at reality and reality sensing, to move back off of the bridge?
Yeah, well, they shouldn't practice the alternative story in those moments, because it is a compulsive activity if that is the case, right? So what they have to go back to is go back to the bridge exercise. Okay. If they're really deep in the bubble, clinically speaking, they're really deep in the bubble, forget it. It's best to not do anything, and then the point is to make sure that they don't fall into it all the time, that the frequency by which they fall into it is lessened, and you can do that the best by doing the bridge exercise, reality sensing, to stop them from falling into it, and to practice the alternative story outside of the bubble. But don't use the alternative story to get somebody out of OCD, because that's when a person is obsessing, it's too difficult. Right. They're too deep in.
Thank you.
It's about keeping them out of it.
Sorry. I guess I'm having a little bit of confusion on the difference between when you're on the bridge and you're going to be either staying in reality or go to the OCD bubble. The difference between what you use for staying in reality versus the alternate story.
Sure. Yeah. So module 8, there's this process that's described like in pretty thorough detail. I believe it's module 8, where you kind of sense that you are approaching that bridge and you pause, and it really is very grounding in the here and now. Like your imagination at that point isn't involved. So it's a totally separate thing.
Okay, so that's the key I missed. So it's the alternate story, you still are using an imagination.
Yeah.
Whereas reality sensing, it really is, you're not making a new story, you're just basing it on what is the here and now.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Well, this has been really awesome. I'm going to stop the recording and I will hang out here for up to a half hour afterwards and we can continue conversing. But I just want to thank everyone for coming and thank you so much, Kate, for such a good presentation and discussion.
Yeah. So I have to go because I have supervision with Fred.